Asserting central dominion, this pawn push immediately opens lines for developing pieces and dictates the initial pawn structure. Securing the center with a knight, preparing for rapid development and offering flexibility in pawn structure. A bold central thrust, immediately contesting black's knight and aiming for a queen's pawn opening dynamic. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop on g7 aims to control the long diagonal and fortify the kingside. Developing the knight to c3 supports the central pawn advance and prepares for potential kingside castling while contesting the d5 square. Challenging the center directly, this pawn thrust immediately creates dynamic counterplay and forces white to commit their pieces. Opening the center creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces black to choose between recapturing with the knight or pawn, impacting their piece activity. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight opens up exciting central play and a dynamic fight for the initiative. Seizing the center, this pawn thrust immediately contests black's nascent queenside influence and opens diagonals for white's bishops. Exchanging the knight frees up the d-file, opening interesting lines for piece play and potentially creating central pawn weaknesses for white later. Opening the b-file with this pawn thrust grants immediate central influence and a clear path for your rook, though it does create doubled pawns, a long-term structural consideration you'll need to manage. Challenging the center directly, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for immediate counterplay. This energetic thrust creates central tension, forcing white to commit to a specific pawn formation, potentially leading to weaknesses on the queenside for either side depending on the ensuing exchanges. Unleashing the bishop here immediately targets the f7 square, a classic weak point in black's kingside pawn structure, especially with the g6 pawn already advanced. This aggressive posture demands careful consideration from black regarding king safety and piece coordination. A slight misstep could lead to significant tactical complications. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal, eyeing the d4 pawn, sets up potential pressure and solidifies the fianchetto structure, preparing for a potential queenside expansion or central pawn break later on. Developing the knight to e2 prepares to castle kingside and reinforces the e4 pawn, which is currently attacked by black's bishop. This often leads to a closed center where pawn breaks become crucial for opening lines. Observe how white's piece placement aims for mutual support, with the knight soon ready to join the defense of the kingside should black launch an aggressive attack there. Safety first, prioritizing the king's security by tucking it away behind the pawn shield is a wise decision, especially with white's bishop eyeing the kingside. This also prepares for potential nc6 development, aiming to contest the center and potentially exploit the doubled c-pawns. Securing the monarch with castling on the kingside completes white's initial development, creating a solid defensive structure and preparing to potentially contest the d-file or support a central pawn push later on. Recentering the knight to d7 now aims to reinforce the pawn chain, prepare for a potential central pawn break with c4, and also allows for future flexibility, perhaps rerouting to f6 or even e5 if the opportunity arises, while avoiding immediate knight-on-knight skirmishes on c3. Proactively securing the queenside and preparing a pawn storm, white aims to stifle black's queenside expansion before it even begins, potentially creating significant space advantages. Asserting central influence and preparing to challenge white's queenside pawn majority, this maneuver offers a dynamic response to white's pawn thrust, aiming to unbalance the position and activate the queen for potential counterplay. Unlocking diagonals for your queen and bishop is the primary goal, aiming to exploit the c5 pawn's forward march and pressure the queenside. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure while preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority is the intent behind this move, a classic maneuver in this type of King's Indian setup. It directly addresses the potential pawn break on c5 that black has been nurturing, creating a more resilient defensive perimeter. Initiating development of the kingside piece battery toward the center, this square solidifies control over the important d4 and c5 squares, preventing immediate pawn advances and preparing for a potential kingside attack. Unleashing the bishop to the a6 outpost immediately targets white's potentially exposed c3 pawn and prepares to control the crucial a6 f1 diagonal, forcing white to consider defensive measures that might compromise their piece coordination. Unlocking the c-file for potential pressure on the queen side, this maneuver aims to reroute the rook to a more active square, possibly supporting an eventual b4 advance or contesting the open c-file should black commit to cxd4. The temporary inactivity of the rook on e1 is a calculated risk, prioritizing central control and the development of a more potent attacking posture over immediate pawn advances. Asserting a central presence, black now anchors a rook on the open d-file, a crucial artery for this battle, potentially eyeing breakthroughs or supporting pawn advances into white's territory. A dynamic shift in focus occurs as white brings the queen to a central hub, threatening to disrupt black's well-entrenched pawn chain on the queen side while simultaneously eyeing the c5 pawn. Now what's next? Opening the center with this pawn thrust creates immediate tension, forcing white to consider how best to resolve the pawn chain and potentially exploit the semi-open d-file. Opening the central d-file, this thrust aims to immediately exploit black's slightly congested king side and potentially create mating threats against the uncastled king by forcing open lines, while simultaneously gaining a queenside pawn majority. Black boldly challenges the central pawn chain, aiming to disrupt white's spatial advantage and open lines for their pieces. This thrust, while seemingly aggressive, potentially weakens the pawn structure on the queen side if white can manage to capture and maintain control of the c4 square. The tension now escalates, forcing white to decide whether to maintain the pawn wall or resolve the conflict, each choice carrying its own strategic implications for the ensuing middle game battle. Unleashing the queen to harass the d5 pawn and the vulnerable c4 square, this move aggressively probes for weaknesses in black's pawn structure, while simultaneously eyeing potential sacrifices on the e5 pawn. Initiating a pawn storm on the king side, 16. f5 boldly challenges white's central control and attempts to pry open lines towards the enemy monarch, forcing an immediate reckoning of piece activity and pawn structure. Unleashing an assault on the f5 pawn, this piece repositions to a central attacking square, immediately challenging black's ambitious pawn advance. The bishop now eyes the weak dark squares around the black king, potentially setting up a future kingside assault. Immediately challenging the powerful bishop on a2, black aims to disrupt white's central control and create counterplay on the kingside, a bold assertion against white's somewhat passive setup. Sensing an opportunity, white bravely ventures the bishop to an outpost, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around the enemy king. This aggressive maneuver immediately intensifies the positional struggle, forcing black to decide whether to defend passively or accept the challenge head-on. Preparing to seize the central open files, this maneuver redirects the rook from its current defensive post to a more active role, eyeing the potential for increased pressure along the 7th rank and supporting the central pawn structure's resilience against white's advancing pawns, while simultaneously creating an escape square on g8 if necessary. Cracking open the center with this pawn thrust, white aims to destabilize black's pawn structure, particularly the d5 square, while simultaneously activating the f-pawn to potentially target the king's defenses. This aggressive pawn sacrifice exploits the current static nature of black's pieces, forcing a reaction and creating immediate tactical complications rather than allowing black to consolidate their position. Consider the implications for the e5 pawn. By removing the defender, white opens lines that could lead to a decisive attack on black's kingside should black misplay the ensuing pawn exchanges or fail to adequately defend. The move creates an imbalance, shifting the game from a quiet positional struggle towards a more dynamic and forcing confrontation, demanding precise calculation from both sides. Observe how this seemingly simple capture dramatically alters the pawn chains and the potential for piece mobility, potentially opening the e-file for white's rook. Opening the f-file now, black initiates a daring counterattack, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and exploit the now exposed kingside. This pawn push transforms a seemingly quiet positional struggle into a sharp, tactical melee where precise calculation will be paramount for both sides. Initiating a queenside pawn thrust to disrupt black's harmonious piece placement and potentially exploit the semi-open c-file could be the idea behind advancing the up pawn. Unleashing the pawn on b5 immediately challenges white's queenside structure, aiming to disrupt the attacking potential that was building on the queenside with the previous a4-a5 advance. This pawn thrust creates immediate tension, forcing white to decide whether to capture, push, or retreat, each with significant positional consequences. Black is essentially saying, "You want to attack me on the queenside? I'll rip it open and see who's better off." It's a bold counterstrike, seeking to exploit the slight awkwardness of white's pieces and the pawn chain dynamics. Reclaiming the crucial central file, this action signals white's intent to sharpen the play and directly challenge black's pawn structure. The rooks are now poised to penetrate, aiming to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's pieces and the potential weakness on the kingside. The knight finds a crucial outpost on c5, challenging white's central control and adding pressure along the queenside diagonal. This aggressive repositioning might be preparing a foray into white's territory, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that arise from the recent pawn pushes. A bold attempt to reorient the knight towards the kingside, hoping to exploit the open kingside files that black's pawn push has created. Unburdening the kingside, black's bishop now finds an active post on e7, anticipating the impending storm and reinforcing the central pawn structure while preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece transfers. Redirecting the queen to the queenside aims to challenge black's advanced pawns and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from their aggressive setup. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside creates fascinating, albeit risky, dynamism. A calculated gamble, sacrificing a pawn to disrupt black's coordinated attack, hoping to exploit the open files and the exposed king in the ensuing chaos, all while eyeing the potentially vulnerable knight on g7. Embracing the initiative, black shifts focus to the kingside pressure, preparing to exploit the weakened pawn structure created by white's advanced pawns. The bishop's excursion to g7 offers a fascinating positional concession, aiming to dismantle the defensive pawn chain and create potential weaknesses around black's king, although it does expose the bishop to immediate capture and potentially opens up the king's defenders to rapid development for the opponent. Sacrificing the rook on the 7th rank opens a perilous diagonal towards white's vulnerable king, a desperate gamble to disrupt white's queenside initiative and inject immediate tactical chaos before the pawn storm on the kingside is fully deployed. Snatching the bishop with the knight opens up a critical diagonal for the white queen, potentially creating immediate attacking threats against the black king that is now exposed on the kingside, especially as black's g-pawn is no longer defending the h-file. The king's exile from its safe haven on g8, though forced by the immediate tactical threats, opens up a fascinating positional battle where the central files become crucial battlegrounds. Suddenly, the immediate objective shifts from the central battlefield to the threatened queenside, aiming to bolster the beleaguered white king by potentially exchanging the problematic dark-squared bishop and freeing up lines for its own pieces. Black's bishop anchors itself on c8, a seemingly passive placement that cleverly prepares for a future advance of the queen's knight pawn, aiming to disrupt white's centralized control and create dynamic possibilities on the queenside. Unlocking the e5 pawn's potential, this queen repositioning prepares to reassert pressure on the kingside and potentially exploit the weakened f7 square, a crucial pivot point after the recent exchanges. The rook's relocation to the 8th rank aims to bolster the beleaguered king's defensive perimeter, attempting to create a more resilient shield against white's impending onslaught. Reclaiming the central square after the tactical skirmish, this maneuver immediately addresses the lingering pressure on the kingside and prepares to bring the remaining rook into the fray. Reactivating the dark-squared bishop on its diagonal after a period of quiet, this maneuver seeks to exploit the sudden weakness around white's king, aiming to pierce the pawn shield with pressure. Suddenly, the queen leaps to the wing, intending to pry open the king's defenses from an unexpected angle. A determined effort to organize the queen's flank and defend the weak pawns begins, offering a slight breathing space. Recentering the bishop to b1 opens up the possibility of developing the rook to d1, adding pressure along the half-open d-file and creating potential threats against black's vulnerable king. A daring gambit to unhinge the kingside defense, accepting a pawn sacrifice for dynamic play and potential breakthroughs. Seizing the open file with the bishop dramatically alters the board's landscape, creating immediate pressure along the g-file and a dangerous potential for white's remaining pieces to infiltrate black's weakened kingside. The pawn advance on the queen's side has finally broken open lines for the black king, creating immediate tactical possibilities around white's monarch. Sharpening the focus on the kingside dark squares, this maneuver prepares a potential kingside assault, seeking to exploit the awkward placement of black's bishop and the exposed nature of the f-pawn. Unleashing the rook to the open e-file represents a direct challenge to white's centralized queen and provides a crucial outlet for black's beleaguered king, aiming to activate dormant pieces and create counterplay along the ranks. A bold attempt to unlock central counterplay by anchoring the bishop, though it might leave the kingside a touch exposed to further pawn thrusts. Sacrificing the queen here appears to simplify, but it opens the king to a terrifying storm along the newly cleared g-file. The immediate tactical consequence is a loss of material, but the deeper positional flaw is surrendering any claim to central control and allowing white's bishops to dominate the diagonals. Seizing the open files now with the rook's exchange is paramount, transforming the board into a stark battle for positional dominance where the king's safety becomes a glaring weakness. The rook's final sweep opens a critical diagonal, irrevocably altering the endgame's balance by forcing a queen trade and leaving white's king acutely exposed. The bishop now shores up the f2 square, a quiet but crucial defensive maneuver ensuring the king isn't immediately exposed to further tactical threats along the diagonal once the rooks are in play. Bringing the knight to the center in this chaotic position immediately challenges the white bishop and opens up the possibility of activating the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. The pawn sacrifice here opens lines and aims to disrupt black's remarkably solid pawn structure, hoping to create attacking chances along the newly liberated diagonals and files. The knight's foray into the enemy camp on c3 ignites a potential tactical storm, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps create mating threats by activating the knight for a later jump to d5 or e4. Exploiting the open king file, white forces a decisive exchange by leveraging the discovered check potential. Relocating the king to f7 initiates a tactical dance, aiming to shield it from the immediate assault and potentially prepare for active defense or even an audacious counterattack.